In this Elden Ring video, I'm going to be showing you guys how to use the Twinblade Talisman properly. A lot of people don't know how to use this talisman, or they think they know how this talisman works. And in this video, I want to show you guys just exactly how to get the most out of it and why you might want to use it in your build. So first, let's take a look at the description of this talisman. It says, a talisman depicting a twin blade and a confessor enhances the final hit ending a chain of attacks. So it doesn't really elaborate on what that means, so it's obvious why some people might get confused, but essentially, this is the final hit of an R1 or an L1 attack chain with whatever weapon or weapons you are using. And just to elaborate a little bit further in case you don't know what I mean by R1 or L1 attack chain, this is when you're either single-handing a weapon or you're two-handing a single weapon, and you press R1 repeatedly and you do different animations and attacks depending on what weapon you're using, and then usually after about 3 to 5 attacks, that chain will stop, you'll have a pause before you can continue again, and then you'll repeat that exact same sequence again. The same is also true if you're dual wielding a weapon type 2 of the same weapon and you're pressing L1, you will have a chain of attacks that will, do somewhere between usually 3 to 5 attacks, and then that chain will stop. You'll have a little bit of a break, and then it will repeat that same sequence of events again. And so it'll always repeat that same sequence in that same order with a little break in between, this time pressing L1. So effectively what this talisman is going to do is it's going to increase the damage of the final hit of your L1 or your R1 combo by 45%. This was actually increased in patch 1.09. It was previously 20%. So this is a big jump since that patch, making it a lot more viable. A lot of people don't know that this was boosted in that patch. And it's something that you can use now a lot more effectively. So let's hone in on that 45% for a second, because you're going to see this on paper and you're going to think, wow, that is a huge increase in damage. And it is. It's a huge increase in damage, but it's a bit misleading because it only applies to the last hit of your chain. And all your other attacks in that chain are not going to see increased damage. And if you do not complete this chain, you will not gain that boost. And that's really, really important because you might get 3 hits of a 4-hit combo and then get staggered or interrupted, or maybe the enemy dies, and then you don't get that damage boost, making this wasted in a lot of cases. And that is the biggest negative of this talisman, is the fact that, a lot of times, particularly when you're fighting regular enemies, they're probably going to die before you ever get that last hit unless you're able to jump from one enemy to the next and continue your R1 combo or your L1 combo, which can happen but is rare. You're really not going to see a lot of benefit from this out on the landscape or in regular dungeons. So you're going to get most impact from this usually when you're fighting like a boss or difficult enemy, something that you're going to have to hit, 7, 8, 9, 10 or more times for them to die. So if you want to use this talisman, the best scenarios to use it are during boss fights, hard to kill enemies, or when there are lots of enemies grouped closely together. So I mentioned a second ago that this works with R1 attacks when you're single-handing or two-handing, and it works with L1 attacks when you're dual-wielding, but it does not work with R2 attacks or charged R2 attack chains. It does not work with Ashes of War that hit multiple times, like Double Slash or something like that. And it does not work with spells like some of the spells that summon weapons and you can attack repeatedly with them. It does not work with those either. So it has to be an R1 chain or an L1 chain while you're dual-wielding. There are a couple special circumstances that I want to mention, though, that this does work with, and the first one is shields. If you're attacking with a shield, it will apply to the final hit of a shield attack chain. Great shields, regular shields, small shields, etc. It doesn't matter what type. That last hit of an attack chain will be affected. This also works with staves and seals if you're attacking with them. Most people are not going to do this because it's not a very good weapon to melee with, but it will apply to the last hit of an attack chain with these weapon types. So if for some reason you're trying to do a meme run, you can use this to increase your damage. And the last point I want to make, probably the most important one, is that there are a lot of weapons in this game that allow you to continue your attack chain after you do a jump attack. What this allows you to do is do like a running jump attack, which is much safer than walking up to enemies and pressing R1 or L1, and then continue with R1 or L1, and usually this will be like 2 or more hits and you'll have completed your combo in a lot of weapon cases, particularly if you're dual wielding. And this will allow you to get your, extra damage from your Twinblade Talisman a lot more easily. But it also allows you to boost your first attack with the Claw Talisman or with something like, Raptor's Black Feathers. So you can get even more damage from the first attack and then get more damage from the last attack. And this is a much more effective way of using this talisman than just using, R1, R1, R1 or L1, L1, L1. Now that we've talked a little bit about how this weapon works, let's talk a little bit about who might use this and what weapons you might use when you're using this. If you're talking about specific weapon groups, Great Spears, Colossal Weapons, and Colossal Swords all only have 3 hits to their combo, which means they're going to get to that last hit probably more quickly than some weapon groups. And also that last hit is usually devastating because these weapons do a lot of damage, or, they have high attack power natively. So that last hit is going to do a lot of damage when it's boosted. So these are really great pairings with this talisman. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't use other weapons, but if you're talking about most effective, if you're talking about single-handed and two-handing, this is probably the most effective weapon groups. But also weapon groups that have, you know, only 4 attacks. If you're talking about like where the cutoff would be, I would say 4 attacks is probably the most I would use for a weapon with this build. There are a lot of weapons that fall into this category, like great swords, curved great swords, that only have 4 attacks before their combo ends, and I wouldn't use any weapon that has more than that. Weapon types that have more than that are like claws, daggers, fists, straight swords, curved swords, stuff like that, where it's actually going to be like 5 hits or 6 hits. Anything about 4 is pretty much the cutoff. Again, 3 hits is better. 4 hits is not that bad. Anything past that, you're really not going to, you know, ever really need to, particularly out on the landscape. But in a boss fight, when you're trying to hit more than 4 times in a row, it's very, very difficult to get that 5th or 6th hit without getting staggered by a boss, because bosses don't just let you stand there and wail on them. So the faster you can complete that combo, the more likely you're going to get the benefit from those weapons. Now, something important I want to mention here is when you dual wield a weapon group, it's usually 1 hit less than what they are when you're single-handing or two-handing. For instance, if you dual wield straight swords, it's 4 hits to end their L1 combo, but it's 5 hits if you're using it two-handed or if you're doing a single-handed R1 combo. So you can actually cut down some of these 4-hit weapon groups if you go dual wield. And I want to also specifically mention that spears work very, very well for this because they only have 3 hits to their combo when you dual wield compared to 4 when they're single-handed, but they also attack very, very fast. So if you're using a dual spear setup, this is a great talisman, and if you're doing a dual wield build of pretty much any weapon type, this is not a bad one to consider if you have high poise and you know you can complete your attack chain in a boss fight. So if you're using this talisman, you're going to want to avoid single weapons that hit more than 4 times to complete a combo, or dual-wielded weapons that take more than 4 L1s to complete their chain. This is typically claws, fists, and daggers. I think everything else is 4 or less in dual wield. So you want to avoid claws, fists, and daggers unless you are super confident you can land your attack pattern, which I'm not, so I wouldn't recommend. And obviously staves and seals, even though you can use them with this talisman, you're probably not going to want to unless you're doing some sort of challenge run. So the long and short of it is you want to make sure that you only use this talisman during bosses or hard to kill enemy fights, because you're usually going to kill regular enemies before it ever triggers anyway. And you also want to make sure that you use it with weapons that complete their combos quickly or relatively quickly to get the most benefit out of it. And because you're going to be using this against bosses, this means that this build's going to have to be hyper aggressive when using this talisman in order to get any use out of it all. So you're going to have to attack no matter what, which means that you're going to need to have high poise so you can tank through a hit, because you most certainly get hit on most of the combos that you will deal. And also you'll have to have high protection and high health so that you don't die when using this talisman. Remember that a lot of weapon groups allow you to jump attack and then follow up with an R1 and another R1, or jump attack with an L1 and then follow up with L1, L1, and still get the damage of this. So this may be a beneficial way to go, particularly in boss fights, where it might be easier to land that running jump attack first rather than stand there in L1 or R1. So that wraps up our Twinblade Talisman guide. I hope you guys found this useful. It's not a talisman that people will use all the time, but it is effective for certain builds, and I wanted to make sure you guys knew exactly how to use it and how to get the most of it. If you have more questions about this talisman, please let me know in the comments below. And if you would love to see other guides about certain talismans or equipments in this game, or more of this sort of content, let me know as well, because this was just kind of off the cuff, and it was something that I kind of tested when I was doing testing for other builds and thought would be useful, but I'm not sure if that's something you guys want to see or not, so let me know in the comments below.